you understand what was my purpose here. What my purpose is to get you a menu of analytic papers that you see what kind of analytics can be designed. And the Denise paper is just like drinking out of a fire hose. It's just too many papers to discuss, 220 pages. So. I think my assignment for this week was too unspecified. From here on, I'm going to say, you do this, and you do this. Correct? Ciao, ciao. That's what we're going to do from here on.
I think the projector's off.
Turn your projector on.
Oh, it's
Don't do it. On.
Yeah.
Peace. That should.
Rand's gonna think.
Okay. You have it.
It's kind of hard to see. Do we have?
You want me to turn the light on?
The lights? I don't know. Can you guys see it? That's good. That's good. Okay, I looked at the paper, A Unified Foundation for Business Analytics by Osapple et al. And this paper basically provides a comprehensive characterization of business analytics and introduces this idea of a business analytics framework. And I just thought it was interesting. In the beginning of the paper, it kind of gives us a history of where we start seeing some of these analytics used. And they go back as early as the 1940s with the computerized, fully automated anti-aircraft fire control system. I thought this was interesting, the Manhattan Project for simulation to predict the course of nuclear chain reactions. So it was just interesting. The paper presented a couple other ones, and then you kind of see getting more into the financial areas, this FICO, the predictive modeling in 1958 to assess credit risk. And then there were a couple others that were presented, Black-Scholes, 1973 for option pricing. So I think it's interesting that, I guess I didn't realize how early some of these analytical procedures go back in time. And then the paper kind of presents this overarching idea of business intelligence. It didn't really give a formal definition, so I looked up online, and one of the common definitions was that it's a set of techniques and tools for the transformation of raw data into meaningful and useful information for business analysis purposes. And then there's this idea that traditionally business intelligence centers on highly structured data, and now there's more of a move towards dealing with unstructured data such as audio, voice, clickstream. And then the authors try to refine a definition for business analytics, which is more, as they put it, a subset of business intelligence. And they come up with a definition that it's an evidence-based problem recognition and solving that happens within the context of business situations. So they kind of take the traditional ideas of data, and they instead choose this word evidence because they think it kind of gives a bigger, wider definition and can include things such as qualitative data and not just this focus on quantitative. And then they use the word problem recognition. I can't remember what. I'll have to look back what originally the idea was on that, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And then some rationales for business analytics to achieve a competitive advantage, support an organization's strategic goals, better organizational performance, better decision outcomes, knowledge production. So there's a lot of benefits that are seen and are readily apparent for business analytics. So then the authors continue, they're kind of trying to just provide like this framework and all the different aspects and ways to look at what analytics are. So they come up with 3 categories, 3 different dimensions. And first you've got your domain, which is the subject to which it's applied, which can be any of the traditional business disciplines, marketing, HR. So basically first you got to figure what area within the business you want to apply the analytics to. And then comes this idea of orientation or the direction of thought, and there's 2 different taxonomies that appear to be used. You have this 3-fold taxonomy of the analytics. The area you're looking at can be either the predictive, descriptive, or prescriptive, can't pronounce today, or a 4-fold taxonomy, which includes sense, predictions, evaluations, and decisions.
It's interesting because it ties with what we do in the Applebaum program and Vasarhelyi paper. We have kind of our categories of
Yeah.
predictive,
Descriptive and prescriptive. Yeah. But then they do kind of, I guess, the difference in the 4-fold would be, I gotta look into that more to see, but so people try to come up with different categories just to organize the different types of analytics. And then there's the technique that's used, so you can look at it as technology-based versus practice-based, quantitative versus qualitative, or structured versus semi-structured versus unstructured data. So it's just trying to give different frames of reference to look at this idea.
Can we just think about examples here of number 3 there?
Structured
What is technology versus practice-based in, let's say, in auditing? IT audit versus, which is technology versus manual examination of transactions. Quantitative versus qualitative is auditor, qualitative is auditor judgment, quantitative is some kind of optimization or just counting numbers or whatever. And structured, semi-structured, etc. is unstructured is basically text data, structured is numerical data, semi-structured is the one that uses both. Is that, I'm just making this up, is that?
That's consistent with how I would categorize some examples. So then I thought this was interesting when they try to come up with this business analytics framework. They throw at you like, what do we have, 6 different possible definitions when they're thinking of what is business analytics. And then they try to organize these and all these different thoughts of how it is into a more
Before I go ahead,
understandable.
can I just ask a question?
Mhm.
What's the difference between BA and BI? You all know what BI is, correct? No.
Business intelligence.
Yes.
The way I interpret it, and that's kind of why I put this on there, because
Yes,
I kind of think that from my brief search just on the internet, because they didn't give an actual definition in the paper of business intelligence. They just start defining analytics. So I guess how I interpreted it was that business analytics is sort of a subset of business intelligence, where you're using either the structured or unstructured data to come up with some sort of problem recognition and solving process.
I like that.
So that's kind of how I interpreted it.
You know, there are entire programs on business intelligence in universities. You can get a bachelor's degree in BI. Did you know that?
So I don't know if anyone else had a different idea. But I think the stress on the analytics is some sort of putting the business data or whatever evidence that you have in some sort of, creating some sort of problem that you need to either recognize, analyze, or solve. And then just, so they go through, and I kind of reorganize these into the process that you'll see later in this diagram. So it kind of, they present these in a different order in the paper, but all these definitions, I think, they try to put in a sequential format, so they really are the building blocks to the whole framework of business analytics. So you start with this movement, and they define it as fact-based decision making is encouraged and rewarded. So I think the stress here is there's got to be an initial push towards using analytics within a firm. It's got to be sort of a part of the corporate culture. And then there's the capability set and transformation process, and I highlighted these because I have some questions at the end. So any sort of statistical, quantitative analysis, explanatory predictive models that drive the decisions. What is the capability set within the firm? And then using this capability set, you have the transformation process that occurs to actually transform the data into any sort of actions, decision-making, problem-solving, whatever the problem is at hand. And then they have all these subsets, collection and practice of technologies and specific activities. So I kind of see these are just maybe the way the firm uses the analytics, what are their policies, what activities are they singling out as in need of analytics? And then decisional paradigm is kind of just the overarching decision-making process surrounding business analytics. So they put it all nicely into this diagram. So it almost seems like what they're doing here, because I found this a little confusing. I don't know if anyone else read this paper. It seems like they're taking every possible definition that someone's come up with for how.
When was this published?
2014?
No, where?
Where?
Decision support systems.
Okay.
Decision support, that's what I
Because I found all these definitions, you know, they each touch on like a key component, but they didn't really even in the paper, they're just quoting a lot of what others have said about these, and then they try to come up with a nice diagram. So I actually think this maybe could be reduced a little bit to what business analytics actually is. But what I did like is this idea is you initially have this movement, you have a capability set within the firm, and then you have a transformation process going on with the data or whatever you're using to come up with your decision or solve your problem. So then I guess I had some questions that I still found as being open, and I'm just curious what, in terms of the capabilities, what capabilities do firms currently have? And this idea is there an optimal capability set for a firm in terms of, you know, obtaining these different types of methods and having the capability of running these procedures? And then in terms of the transformation process, how should we be transforming the data or evidence? And then what are the related costs? So I didn't know if anyone had any thoughts about these.
I have a first thought about
Yeah.
this. Is very you notice they really didn't use any data on this paper. This is a total conceptual paper, and it's kind of a reorganization of kind of industry practices. and is conceptualized. So you know, you can write a paper just sitting on the library and looking up articles. Is that bad or is that good? You don't have to go to CompuStat. You don't have to go to corporate data. That was my first thing. Second thing, I never really seen a paper that picks up 6 concepts and tries to homogenize them. I didn't read the paper, so let me ask you the first question. They pick up those 6 concepts from different articles, and
yes. And they're trying to just put them all under one umbrella of this decisional paradigm. But I think it actually, I think what I would have liked to see is have them simplify it a little bit more. Because like I said, I like the idea of these first 3, because that gets you thinking about, well, is there even this push? I know there's a push with researchers now for these business analysts, but what's the push going on within individual firms? What are their capabilities? There was another interesting paper looking at the analytical review procedures. Yes?
I have a question to ask the professor. Could I say continuous auditing is a implementation of this framework?
If continuous auditing is an implementation of this framework. I guess the framework tries to be everything. Also, going to the bathroom is an implementation of.
I feel some similarity, about the continuous auditing.
Yeah. That's true. I don't know.
Actually, interesting you asked that, because I was thinking something similar. If we could pick up like several things, accounting measurement as one, and business analytics the other one, the third one, something like ERP measurement, and put it together into a framework for continuous audit. That's what you kind of generated in me. See?
I mean, I think it's nice to conceptualize things such as these abstract concepts like business analytics, but again, I think they pulled from too many sources and they didn't do any of their own.
My first dissertation advisor was a guy called Dick Mason. And Dick Mason was a student of a guy called C. West Churchman, who was a professor at Berkeley. And Dick Mason studied with Churchman. And Churchman wrote a very famous book called The Systems Approach. And the system is basically a little bit like this. It's kind of an overall view of this. And then Robert Anthony. Have you ever heard his name? Gee, you guys are so young. How can you not know Bob Anthony? Bob Anthony was a professor at Harvard. And he developed a thing called Framework for Planning and Control. And basically he was the father of the idea of responsibility centers. You know what a responsibility center is in managerial accounting? Profit center, cost centers, investment centers. That's the generic name for those things. And Anthony, maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, developed the most important thing, I guess, in managerial accounting is basically responsibility centers. And part of that is cost accounting. But the generic view is called responsibility centers. And so Bob Anthony was a very famous professor at Harvard. I don't think he died yet, but he must be 150 years old, but something like that. But he is a very interesting guy. And then West Churchman developed this thing he called the systems approach. And then Bob Anthony was taken to the Department of Defense and became a subsecretary of defense in charge of rationalizing things. And so the Air Force had an airplane, the Navy had another airplane that they were developing, the Army had an airplane, the Marines had an airplane. And so the idea was to bring together all of them into one airplane. And so he installed the responsibility centers in the Army, and was Kennedy and then Johnson administrations. So it was a very powerful type of thing that influenced a lot what we do today. Of course, the moment Anthony left, each one of the branches of the army went back to their own devices. But it was very, very interesting and forming thought in managerial accounting. So this name, Robert Anthony, is something that you should remember. And then, my advisor, Dick Mason, was a student of C. West Churchman, and C. West Churchman was a philosopher. And this book, Systems of Work, has these components, and he kind of explains processes around these components. And Mason was his disciple and was even more philosopher. And Mason and Mitroff wrote a famous article, a framework for information systems. And basically it's an article like this, but more oriented towards computer information systems. A side of the story is that Professor Mason was my professor at UCLA, and when I gave him my first chapter of my dissertation, he sat on it for 3 months. So I changed advisors. And it wasn't very good for the relationship of Professor Mason and Professor Mark, but I went over to Professor Mark, who used to read my chapters in a week. Dick Mason is a great guy, but he also took him 10 years to finish his dissertation. Just was slow on what he did. Very smart guy, was very charismatic. I loved to hear him talk and etc. Really interesting. And he got his PhD a little bit older, so he was system analyst before. Very interesting guy. But if you look at Mason and Mitroff, the management science article, Chow, remind me, I'll give you the article and you pass it to everyone. Okay? Mason and Mitroff. Okay, Ian Mitroff, I think, was at Wharton, and Dick Mason finished up at Georgia Tech. But it's kind of this, maybe a little bit easier to read. Okay, thank you very much.